My name is Walter Ryce. I'm an arts and entertainment writer at the Monterey County Weekly, and I'm glad to have on the show as my guest, painter Lucas Blok. Thanks for coming, Lucas.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Good to be here.
I'm going to start off with a bit of your history coming to the country from your native Holland.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier when we were getting ready for this, I was born in the Netherlands, in Gouda, which is the town of cheese. But I didn't get a long time to stay there. We left by the time I was 1 year old. We moved to Canada, and when I was 4, my family moved back to Holland, and then back to Canada when I was 8. And when I was 12, we moved to the United States, and at 13, I ended up in the Bay Area and settled in.
And that was in the 60s, and you were in the Bay Area?
Yeah.
Pretty creative time?
Pretty creative time. I was playing a little music and starting to get into doing some things. I actually studied guitar, I'm proud to say, with Jerry Garcia. I was really happening, you know.
Oh, wow. So a part of that creative atmosphere back then involved, I'm sure, visual art.
Well, part of what moving around had done for me, I think, was I had lost the sense of where I belonged in the world. You know, I was changing languages, I was changing cultural mores, I was making friendships, which usually took a year or two, and then I was losing them. I was spending a lot of time constantly out of control, basically, or the world seemed out of control. And when I finally settled down in the late 60s, sort of was in one place for a couple of years, or 3 or 4 years, I started doing creative work in school and working with music, and I found that world allowed me to sort of discover myself in that process. In the process of creating things, I could actually start making sense of my position within my own experience rather than constantly adjusting to the new world, as it were, which came from the immigration issues.
Can you talk about that painting that you encountered in your apartment?
Yeah,
the canvas, I should say.
I was taking art classes at the local JC, as it were, and in the second year I was in one of the advanced classes where we had to bring in our work, and I had decided I wanted to do some painting, but I still didn't really have a voice. But I moved into an apartment right about at the same time, and there was a 5 by 5 foot square stretched canvas. It was almost a gift. It sort of just showed up. But then I had to decide what I was going to paint. You know, I had been drawing the figure, I had been doing various exercises with pastels and pencil, but now it was time to actually paint. And so I laid the canvas on the ground, and the painting that was going on in the school at the time was a lot of action painting, which meant you just experience the sense of painting and you let the painting pull you through and sort of let yourself converse in the conversation of paint and the application of paint. And so I just started painting on that canvas, and it went from one area to another. I tried staining and I tried painting, and finally I just kept working, and finally that painting turned into what I think was the seed of the work that I've done for the other 40 years that I've been doing work.
Did you give that painting a name, a title?
No, nothing I do has titles. Part of that is there's no real association or message in it, so they're usually dated or numbered or something like that.
Okay. So in 1976, that's when you moved to Carmel.
Right.
And how did that influence what you painted and how you painted and where you progressed from there?
Well, the painting that I had done back in the late 60s, that first big painting, had kind of atmospheric qualities to how the paint ended up being smushed and pushed around. And then it had rectilinear kind of forms in it as well. I don't know where that came from. I don't know how that form developed. It probably had some hint somewhere. But I did a number of paintings that had that kind of smudgy, atmospheric kind of clouds, and working with stripes and rectilinear forms as well. And then I got into the aspect of having to make a living. And so the painting kind of died back, and I did commercial photography, and I did graphic design, and ran a printing press, various things to make a living. But when I got to the Monterey area, Carmel, I happened to mention this to a friend who I had met, Will Bullis, and he asked if I would join him in a two-man show. So it forced me to, again, go back to painting. And it was very fortuitous. It was like I needed that. And So when I look back a couple of years since I had painted and what to paint in these new series, I decided that I would keep the lineage going, but I was living in Carmel and fog, and the whole thing of atmosphere and the whole sense of the natural world that I was experiencing was really wonderful. I mean, I don't know if you're from this area originally, but the hit when I first got here was pretty stupendous. And so there was a tendency to pull into, or pull that experience into my work a little bit. So the work I started painting was literal, more literal in terms of rather than atmospheric kind of clouds. They were literally more cloud-like, with combined with some line work and minor color sort of just as a highlight. They were more, not necessarily representational, but they were associative, very much so. And that was the beginning. Like everything else, you start with one reason to do a painting or start painting, but as you progress, the paintings start to guide you along, or the process of creating work, you start to see things and experience things in life that keep moving on and start changing. One of the major things, I think, at that time, too, was my wife, Barbara Ruzichka, found herself finally getting into music more. She's a pianist. The type of work I was doing was not necessarily part of the art scene here in Carmel, per se. It was more personal than that, and I didn't really have a school of thought. You know, I wasn't working with other people in similar vein, but my wife was in music, and the power that she was starting to generate in improving her piano playing and her music was influencing how I wanted to make decisions about what I was doing visually. And that process kind of led into color. Just as in music, there's a sense of tonal color and so forth. That conversation started happening in how I developed my painting. The change that started to happen with my painting was that I really didn't understand why I was painting, except I liked making nice pictures, and I had a little precocious tendency to make pictures and images that people liked, and I liked making them. But they weren't necessarily talking about anything that had any real connection to my process so much. And I liked, as I started painting more and more, there's that whole process of what does the painting, what do I want to have, what's happening with me in the painting, and there's a guiding thing that happens with the work for me. At least it was a personal process of sort of finding an experiential aspect to what a painting should be. I liked what happened in the 20th century, where painting no longer became about a narrative or about a political statement or about illustrating a message to the illiterate or any of that stuff. It became a real personal journey for both the artist and for the viewer. And that whole existential aspect to art, I think, was a really defining and profound change in what the purpose of art was. So in trying to relate to that on my own level, you know, I felt that with music there was a sense of mystery about it, in a way that, you know, why do we determine that certain aspects of sound and tone and rhythm become music to us, that we as beings choose to associate in such a way that we find that particular experience emotional, we find it stimulating, we find it, it's an experience in itself. And in that way, I wanted my paintings also to have that similar kind of process where it's not about something, it's not about me, it's not about a school of thought, it's more about, at the moment of the painting being presented to an audience, it becomes its own entity. And for people to look at it, it becomes really, or I really want a piece to be their experience, that it's part of them. It's a communion between me and the person viewing the painting, that I create the painting from my own experiences and processes, and then when the painting is put on the wall and presented, it becomes the viewer's process and experience. Mm-hmm. And I find that's kind of a fascinating idea. I mean, to me, the whole aspect of how we generate and create our experience in life, our lives, you know, we're not really taught much about that in schools. It sort of becomes a philosophical and personal journey if you're lucky. And I've been fortunate that somehow through my painting, I feel like I've found that in my life, in that process, and I value it a lot. And I try to hold on to that when I do my work.
So just kind of expounding a little bit on the relationship between music and your paintings, is there a particular type of music that correlates well, that in your mind, with your paintings, like jazz, bebop, or Contemporary classical music?
Not really. No, my wife is a classical pianist, and so I hear music from the 17th century to the early 20th century, middle 20th century. But I love music in all its forms. But I haven't. There were times when I thought I should try and develop that kind of relationship a little more clearly, kind of like Kandinsky talked about, and that whole aspect of. It's been talked about before, the relationship of music to painting. But I found oftentimes in the past people would kind of start putting bars and dots and spots and things, almost like musical literature, the actual printed communication from the composer to the musician. But I found that became too affected. I really, I just want the experience. And my own paintings probably have their own genre. I mean, I don't know if they're jazz or classical or whatever, but there's been no attempt to associate it with anything in particular. It's really, the nice thing about living in a small community like this, which is such a fantastic place to spend one's time in terms of nature and well, just being here, it allows me to just paint the way I want to paint. There's not a lot of input from anybody else. It's really my real personal work, and it just develops as it does.
So that almost seems to suggest that you don't necessarily, as far as like the type of work that you do, that you don't have a lot of peer group?
Not really, not really. I think the funny thing that's happened in the process of painting, I mean, it's hard to talk about, but I have done the work as honestly as I can for myself. I've not really tried to imitate anybody or been inspired particularly by anything, although there's an exception, but I'll mention that later. It's been just an adventure for me. It's like I go in and I feel like I'm communicating with something else. There's a whole process of, I think I mentioned earlier, the idea of push and pull that happened with the expressionism, which is that idea that you're in control and then all of a sudden you realize you're not in control. You have to let go and realize something is coming to you, because the reason you start a piece or a painting is not necessarily what's happening over the 2 or 3 weeks or month that you're working on that painting. You're growing, you're having dinner with your friends, you're having a cup of coffee, you hear an idea, you see something, you experience something, and that all ends up in the work in a way. It affects how you're seeing it as it progresses. I've been fortunate enough to sort of allow that experience to be part of my life. I've had the good fortune to sort of live that way.
Where do you primarily show?
I show in Los Angeles every 2 or 3 years in Culver City area, in Culver City exactly, in a gallery there called the SPFA, and they're friends, and they have a great exhibition space, and they allow me to show my work, and I can do large paintings, which I really enjoy doing, because I think the type of thing I'm doing is when it becomes environmental, and the larger the better, in a way. So I do that every 2 or 3 years. I've showed the museums. I don't have very much luck with galleries. I don't know if over the years, it's a little different today with digital reproduction, but initially the way you made contact with galleries and curators was you sent 35mm slides in a sheet, and they would see if they were interesting enough. Or you graduated from Yale and then you got introduced to these people. But I lived in Carmel, California, and everything I've done has been by the support of people who know my work, who introduce me to other people, and I'm really very fortunate in that I couldn't do what I do without the continual support of friends and people who are aware of the work. So it's really, really straight stuff. It's not really hyped too much.
Okay. So it sounds like another aspect of the Monterey County that recommends it to your living here and working here, is that you've got support here, it sounds like.
Very much so. I mean, I think that's the decision to stay in Monterey. I mean, there came a time when we actually left Monterey for 3 years. We lived in San Francisco and London, and it was interesting to work in those different environments, different way of being. But ultimately, you know, I'm not in a relationship. I'm in a relationship. I'm not a soul alone. I mean, my life is not me by myself. It's me with my relationship for 40 years, and that's the life. That's my life. The painting is a major portion of how I spend my private time, and I spend a lot of time doing that. But everything is in consideration of me being with someone else and her decisions and part of her way of life. And that means that I didn't go and become a dishwasher in New York in 1974 and live in a cold water flat and do my painting, which I probably could have done if I was a solo guy kind of person, but I wasn't. So here, living here has allowed us, my wife and myself, Barbara and myself, to actually live a life that's been very rich in the natural aspects, and it's been a learning experience for us. And we have a tremendous community of friends who are all brilliant in their own realms and their work and what they do. I mean, other artists, other writers of major stature. I mean, things do come here, and people do come here who have experienced the other side of New York, like New York. And so there's a lot of richness that has happened because we live here.
Yeah. I want to talk specifically about some of what you're trying to convey, or at least do with your paintings. And one of the things, as you said, are these sort of movements in which, how do you create movement in something that's static, like a painting?
Yeah, I think I told you the earlier story, which I used a couple of weeks ago at a lecture at AIA, that there was a painting I did in 1996 that was part of an exhibit at the Monterey Museum of Art, and it was a 6 by 12 foot color painting. And it was showing during the summer, so a lot of kids were being bussed in to have a museum experience. And 2 boys were misbehaving in one of these tours, and so the teacher sat these 2 boys on a bench right in front of this 6 by 12 foot painting as a punishment. And then the rest of the class moved on, but all of a sudden a yell came out from the 2 boys yelling, "It's moving, it's moving." Yeah. And I thought that was kind of funny. But the point is, the painting isn't moving. You know, the audience is moving. The viewer is moving. It's, you know, life is not static. Nothing in life is static. My paintings are static, but the viewing isn't static. Our eyes are, when we look at something, are constantly scanning and looking and trying to find and our conscious brains are trying to make decisions about what we see. I mean, it's an amazing process of back and forth and control that we take for granted. But in that process, with color in particular, the brain is, you know, color is not existing in the world. It only exists in your mind. It's purely your generation, your creation. And what is happening is not necessarily anything that would happen with me exactly the same way. I mean, I don't know if your shirt looks the same to you as it does to me. You know, that subtle purple, black may not look that way to you, or we may use the same words, but it's not necessarily exactly what we see. So there's a process of scanning and averaging that our brains do to create color, and contrast makes a difference, and edges and things make a difference. So in my painting, I try to play with those kinds of aspects. I use really rudimentary shapes, rectangles, and some stripes and bars.
Literally blocks.
Yeah. Hey. But you know, they evolved out of that painting back in 1969. I was using rectangles in that, and I was looking at people like Frank Stella and things like that. But I just held on to them because it was just something to hang color on. But I've tried to make them as uninteresting as possible. I mean, a rectangle's not that exciting to most people. You know, it doesn't say much. But the reality, of course, is the rectangle is also very man-made. There's not much in nature that's a rectangle. So it has that double sort of connection too, which is symbolically, it's purely man-made. At any rate, the rectangles oftentimes have hard edges, which allows the color to react on a very close realm to the main body of the rectangle, and it affects the color next to it. And then I use soft edges at times to also change your focus, but at the same time, a soft edge will affect the color over a larger area. And so you get different kinds of color effects, and ultimately, your brain gets overloaded by one thing or another and starts generating its own color. So you'll start to see after images, and images will start to move and shake, and some of them will actually disappear, and certain things will appear that aren't there, that you're generating in your process of creating what's happening on that canvas. I'm not a pure abstract expressionist in terms of, you know, the idea of abstract expression was that one could feel an emotion and then take paint and a brush and then go at a canvas and somehow transfer that emotional state through the activity that occurred in the canvas. I think that's a marvelous process, and I think there were very successful artists who did marvelous pieces that way. You know, I'm Dutch. Emotions are much more reserved, but the pieces aren't necessarily a transfer of my emotions so much as they are, from my perspective, they're archaeological in terms of I made decisions on certain days about certain things and about what was happening in the painting based on where I was at that particular moment. And I can look at a painting now and that I haven't seen for 10 years, and somehow I can go, I can switch right back to the time and the process in creating the paintings and relive and reevaluate the decisions I made and why I made those decisions in the painting. And in that way, they have that kind of connection to me. But right now I have a gallery in Carmel where I actually can show my work locally, which has sort of been a new development because I don't show here very often.
That's at, where is that at?
That's at the Carmel Plaza on the 3rd level. And now I have to sit with those paintings all day long, which is a new experience in a way. But I've also sort of gotten a new way of looking at my paintings, which is they're constantly being presented in a formal environment, and I can see how I react to that over time, as well as how people who come in and actually look at the work and how they react to that. It's kind of like the Japanese tradition of when you have an exhibit of your work, oftentimes the artist will sit in the gallery at the same time, as if to be part of, that the exhibition is part of, that the artist is part of the exhibition in a sense, that there's no separation between the work on the wall and the artist sitting there.
Do you use color to contrast or complement each other, or how do you choose your colors?
Well, it usually works out where one painting is leading to another painting. I mean, the lineage it doesn't, the paintings don't stop. It just comes to a time when a particular piece is finished. Yeah. And somewhere in that process of creating a painting, there's another idea that happened, or something struck me as I'd like to try, or you know, it's another starting point. You know, the trick always with the painting is knowing how to end. And I end a certain phase and then begin another painting. And sometimes there's a consideration of, if I'm having an exhibit, for example, I have to consider what that painting will mean in relationship to another painting as part of an exhibit. In terms of the coloring, I think if you look at the lineage, you'll see that there's a relationship, and there are certain groups of colors. Right now, I'm really crazy about yellows. They've always been a challenge to me over the last years, and I'm finally having some breakthroughs in that. And my trick right now is trying to figure out how to make a piece have that kind of vibrance and energy and change and movement and development, and yet become a minor key. In other words, if you go towards the grays, you'll find a more somber experience with the painting, while a nice bright color has a tendency to be uplifting. It's not to associate myself, but like Mozart, you know, most things he wrote were in major keys, and the music always makes you feel really great. And it's kind of, color does that too. There's just a sense of life about it. It's like playing the blues on the banjo. It's kind of tricky. I've always tried to refer to like what was going on with the human potential movement in Esalen and so forth, the idea of becoming more conscious of one's existence and more aware of how one positions themselves in this world, I guess, as it were. And I think my work connects to that very much so. I think the work is almost on the way, or perhaps related to a meditative process too. That I think I'd like to work with that more so and have that more developed in the work.
What can we anticipate seeing from you? I mean, aside from your own gallery at the Carmel Plaza, do you have any shows coming up locally?
I'm scheduled to have an exhibit at the Monterey Museum of Art in May, and I hope to have a show in Culver City in the fall. So those are the two things I'm working on right now.
So something we can all look forward to.
I hope you can come.
All right, I do too. I want to thank you again, Lucas, for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. Enjoyed it.
My pleasure.